Martin, you've spent over 30 years in the NHS, over 10 years working with Samaritans, a number of years consulting with various different charities and organisations, and that's just naming a few of the things that you've done. But where did it start for you? What first drew you into working in this space?
Well, in mental health, I suppose you've got to go back to when I was a student at Oxford, and I just had a bit of a breakdown, really. I didn't enjoy my first year at Oxford at all. Just thought I was supposed to just go and work hard, and I just wasn't prepared. I think it was, as an adult, I was only about 18, and I just hadn't fully matured into an independent adult, so I just found it a bit overwhelming. And I took a year out, and like most people do have mental health problems, they try to help other people with mental health problems in order to project their own problems onto other people. But actually, that's not a bad thing to be doing. It's how everyone probably starts, and then they start looking at their own lives. So I took a year out of university, got into mental health volunteering. Then when I went back, I changed to psychology. I was doing classics, Latin and Greek, and then just changed to psychology, which was amazingly lucky because I was doing a 4-year course and I'd already done a year. So I had 3 years or less than 3 years to do psychology, but they let me change. So which I'm always grateful to the president of the college who let me change. That's back in the late 70s, so showing my age. But so that was the first thing, just my own struggle to get into a healthy adult space for myself. And realize, and I've been years of just gradually realizing that's what I was doing. I was just doing it blindly. And then I got into clinical psychology. I was a musician for a while, then I got into clinical psychology, and then into therapy, family therapy, psychoanalytic therapy, got into the NHS, started to develop as a person. And as you get more mature and learn more, you can help other people mature more and develop. So, it's just been a constant journey. It's a bit of a cliche, but yeah, I'm still learning. I'm in my 60s now, but, it still feels like a new subject because like anyone who studies anything with proper scientific curiosity, the more you look at something, the more vast it becomes. And the more the obvious things aren't so obvious when you start questioning them.
Yeah, I suppose it's ever evolving with how the world changes as well. There's different potential triggers and stuff that pop up throughout the course of history.
Yeah.
But going into, as we spoke before, you've been in the area sort of 40 years or so. Over that time, have you seen any changes in terms of mental health levels? Has it got worse? Has it got better?
It's interesting. In some ways, it hasn't changed a lot. Like in some ways it has, but in terms of there's more people are now more prepared to say talking is good for you, even though they don't know what that means half the time. So when I started in the early 80s, I suppose, the psychiatric model of mental illness was even more powerful than it is today. It was the dominant model, and talking was like an alternative to that.
Right.
Nowadays, it's like talking is seen as important as medication, which I suppose is progress. So there is that change, and you get different fashions throughout all decades. Like now, I think people are more into autism, Asperger's, ADHD. There are fashionable things. There was eating disorders. Was all of these. You seem to get these fashionable disorders with each decade, and so social changes drive mental health patterns a little bit. But basically, the nature of life has become more urban, more alienating social relationships. We're less living in small communities. This has been over the 20th century into the 21st century. We're more fragmented and we travel further, and we're less connected to local areas. But we're more connected online now. So it's a bit hard to say all the things that protect mental health. Some of those are improving and some of them are decreasing. So it's hard to say whether there's but the biggest, I suppose the big thing that remains the same is you're still basically treated like you've got an illness and you need a doctor as a sort of first port of call. If you've got a mental health condition, which I hate that phrase. If you're struggling with your mental health, or you just feel bad about yourself, which is all it means really, the first gatekeeper you go to is a general medical practitioner. So that's still a primitive system, really. You haven't got a psychologically minded. I mean, some GPs are brilliant, but if you're not a brilliant, if you're a GP that's not brilliant at mental health, no one's going to tick that box and say you shouldn't be doing that gatekeeping role. So basically, you're a bit of a lottery as to who you see in the primary care end of the system. So that hasn't changed much in some ways. Well, GPs are now probably more educated in mental health than they used to be, and more interested in it. And perhaps there's a different kind of GP. You've got more women doctors, more women clinicians, which is probably a good thing. Uh, but in psychology, there's less and less men now doing it. So it's gone the other way. You don't really have many men now in psychology, whereas go back to the 1960s, 70s, 80s, there were more men. So things do change. It's hard to evaluate what's good and what's bad about the change.
Yeah. Just briefly, with that idea of your first port of call being a GP currently, what would be the alternative? What would that look like? What do you think would be the best option there?
Well, I had this idea years ago, but I sort of went down well with certain people, but you have no power to change things really. And that was that you should have a GP as a general medical practitioner. So there should be at least in every community, at least one general psychological practitioner who's just there to look at your mental health and work with the GP. I used to do that myself when in very early 90s. I used to work in a surgery in Bishop Stortford when I was in the local health trust doing psychology, and I did a day a week with the GPs. They really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed learning from them. And we created a sort of mental health team in primary care. I'm sure there are some practitioners out there in primary care doing that, or I'm sure there are good ones out there, but it's not like a standard. It's not like a standard that you have to meet to have a team with a psychological practitioner in it in primary care. And I think that would be a benefit, because a lot of the work I did in primary care when I did it was just helping the GP. They'd bring me their clients and I'd say, oh, you don't need to refer them to me. This is what's happening. And just help them feel confident to stick with their clients, their patients. We always have this problem in mental health. You call them clients, patients, service users, but they're just people. So really, I think that's how I would change it mainly, that your gatekeeper, you have a psychological gatekeeper who's in the system alongside the GPs, working with them and helping them.
Yeah, it makes sense. It sounds like a good idea. And like you say, it helps then educate the GPs and reinforce them to make decisions as well around it, not always having to refer.
Yeah.
And in society at the minute, I suppose, I don't know if it's a recent thing or if it's always been this way, but it feels like everyone's always busy. There's almost like a badge of honor with being busy all the time and leading to being on the brink of burnout.
Yeah.
Working yourself so hard, working more hours to get a promotion. How can people look after themselves a bit more and maybe trying to avoid those burnouts, that stress, and then that sort of sickness that comes from that?
Yeah, that's a good point. Especially now, people can work from home and work online and never stop. They've got a laptop all the time and you could never switch off. So, yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, but it is true that one needs to have punctuation. There's nothing more bad for your health than just completely not having any stimulation. And just, people think it would be nice to have a break. Yes, but if you just kept having a break and never did anything, you'd get very bored and restless. Equally, if you're just busy all the time, then you're kind of accumulating stress, without even being aware of it. And of course, some people are sort of almost become addicted to sort of the buzz of working, and that can be dangerous if it's like addictive rather than actually healthy. So what does health look like? It just looks, and it's not the same for all people. Some people are more on a higher fuse than others, and people's sleep patterns are different. People are different, but at the end of the day, there has to be some punctuation and recharging. And if you're dealing with anything stressful, you need to process it. Whether it's different for different people. Read a book, talk to someone. It's not like you have to talk about things to process them. This is, I'm sure we'll get onto this later about men's mental health. You know, the idea that men should talk more isn't always the right approach to say that to them. And it isn't always necessary to talk to process feelings, but
Mm.
you just need to be aware that you've taken in so much stress, and then you have to process it before you can take another load. So really is gaps. I suppose this has happened over the decades and even a century or two, hasn't it? Workers' rights. Workers never used to get a holiday, did they? And then
Yeah.
they suddenly realised working people need a holiday and a break. Well, where's all this understanding come from that we need breaks? And probably when people invented holidays, there were a few people objecting to it that they were all lazy. You know, all snowflakes for wanting a weekend or something. So our culture, in terms of how much we should work, is always evolving. And I'm no great expert on what the pattern should be. But in terms of mental health, well, I mean, that's why we sleep, isn't it? You kind of have to recharge, and so it needs to be. But the key clue to whether your mental health is good is if you can actually stop and actually feel okay just doing
Yeah.
nothing, and if you can get into work and feel okay doing something. If you feel like you've got to keep working, or you've got to, or you can't stop, then I think that's a little clue that you just need to adjust something.
Yeah. Yeah. I was speaking to a few of my guests recently about that, what you mentioned at the start, with terms of people working from home a lot, and that where that blurred lines start to come into it.
Mm.
And like one of my guests was speaking about how he uses the tube as his way to say, right, now I'm going into work mode, now I'm coming out of work mode. And it's just having that little break and
Yeah,
that moment to
that's good.
break them apart, essentially, especially now with that, like you said, the hybrid working
The
and stuff.
boundary, it sets a nice boundary, and a lot of people use the traveling process to do that. So if you're working from home, yeah, that's really hard. You
Mm,
almost got to have a room which you use for one reason, or a time frame where you use it in a. But people find their own way of doing things. It's the important
yeah.
thing is to know that you can't just work non-stop, and human beings wouldn't do very well not being active. You know, they want to be active and then have rest. So it's that rhythm
Yeah.
that you have to find in your own. And some people like to relax by doing stuff, don't they, when they go on holiday or whatever. Other people just want to lie on a beach. And there's no right or wrong, because what's right about it is that you're doing something that feels good to you. It sounds a bit obvious, but tune into what you actually enjoy.
Yeah.
Some people
Everyone's
forget their
individual.
own needs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
100%. One of your recent publications was about a new framework called Prolonged Ruptured Attachment Syndrome,
Mm.
or PRAS. Can you give us a brief overview of what that is and how that sort of came about and how it affects people?
Yeah, it just came about because I've been working on men. A lot of my stuff is these days on men's issues, and I work with a colleague, Zach Fine, who was interested in parental alienation. Fathers in particular, but also mothers who can't get to see their kids because of
Mm,
separation, and then it becomes difficult, gets into the court system or whatever. And you've got a child is your child. They're out there in the world, but you don't get to see them. You know,
mm,
we got into what is that psychologically? Is that trauma? Is it grief? What is it? And we realized it was sort of something a bit different. It's like a prolonged rupture in an attachment that's still there. Bit like if you had a hostage situation, or we had it with COVID.
yep.
People had people out there, but they couldn't reach them. They couldn't get to them. And then you'd have it with dementia, where someone is there, but you can't really reach them anymore. You can't. So we thought we needed a new concept, which wasn't like trauma, because trauma tends to happen and then it's over and you recover.
Mm,
So it wasn't like that, because it's an ongoing separation. And it wasn't kind of just separation because it's not loss because the person's still there. So so we wanted a phrase. It's probably a long-winded phrase, but something to describe what is actually quite a normal thing you see in mental health. People present with these issues, but it hasn't got a name really. So we thought by
yeah.
giving it a name, it might help articulate a way of understanding that you can't resolve it. It's helping people to live with it. It's a bit like grief work, because when you lose someone you really love, you're never going to get over it. What you do is learn to live with it.
Mm.
You can't go back to, you can't recover to how you were before you lost your love of your life. Your life's always changed by it, but it's how to live with that, make a new life. Uh, when someone's still out there who you can't see, like a child you don't see, because you've been separated, or someone with dementia who you love and you can never get back to those conversations you used to have, you've got to find a way of managing that. And we needed so it affects people very badly, I think, because you can't resolve it, because it's ongoing. But because there isn't a concept of helping people do with that, and we have a deal with that sort of thing, we have a treatment model in the NHS and the public mental health, really. People are looking for treatment. There's no treatment for it. It's a way of living with it. And
Yeah.
a lot of what I do psychologically is helping people live with things. Like, can't change everything. What you can change is how you live with something,
Yeah.
and make it more manageable and more normalize it a bit. It actually is. You're going to have really conflicting feelings when you're going to have a changed life if there's someone you love that you can't in any way simply be with anymore in the way you used to be.
And I suppose the first stage of learning to live with something is by understanding it. So by giving it that name and giving it that understanding, that's what
Yeah,
we're aiming to do there.
that's what we hope, because we've written a paper on it, and our other colleague, Valerie Sanderson, who's a very eminent psychoanalytic writer, we all got excited by the concept because we thought it captured something that wasn't really being described. So where that goes, I don't know. We'll write some more about it. We might start trying to incorporate it into how we train people, and it would be a good thing to introduce into training courses on psychological work, because and things like, even like the Samaritans or whatever, because a lot of what the Samaritans do when I used to work with them is, I said to the volunteers, you can't always change everyone's life. What you can do is help someone live with something that isn't going to change. In fact, sometimes as Samaritans, someone's life is going downhill a bit, but you help it go downhill a bit slower. Anything where you can make a difference to someone else's life and make it less bad than it would have been is worth doing. But we have this sort of expectation. We've got to treat people, cure them, and make everything wonderful. And that in the helping professions, that becomes a bit of a pressure.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can only just make a bad situation a bit less bad.
Yeah. I suppose pre-COVID, it would have been something that not everyone could have understood, because, like you say, things like people living with dementia or maybe parental alienation, not everyone experiences those, whereas everyone experienced COVID. So it sort of brings it in and gives you an example that relates to everyone in order to explain what you mean.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah, definitely. I think it's a really interesting concept, and I totally, I see where it's going. So
Yeah, and COVID probably made us, probably without COVID, we might not have had that idea, because it sort of added an extra dimension to it. But so we'll see where we go with that. But it does tap into my other interest in mental health, which is about, not that I'm an anti-medical, there are some psychological practitioners who are forever anti-psychiatry and anti-medical. No, and people do benefit enormously sometimes from medical interventions. And some of the things that doctors do that help you are psychological anyway, because they're human beings as well. So this idea that a doctor doesn't have a psychological impact is a bit stupid. But also the idea that a psychologist doesn't have a biological impact, because if you talk to someone, it changes the brain chemistry.
yeah,
The thing that most changes brain chemistry is life. You don't have to take a drug to change brain chemistry. You go and see a comedian,
yeah,
and your serotonin will change if you laugh. So, this idea that there's medical model and psychological model, that split is a little bit unhelpful anyway.
yeah. It's not totally separated for sure. You mentioned as well in the start there about how your work has gone into more male psychology over recent years. When did that change occur, and what was it that sort of drew you into going down that pathway?
Yeah, it was a specific. Sometimes there is a light bulb moment, sometimes there isn't. In me, there was a bit of a light bulb moment. I was the head of psychology in a London mental health trust. So, I'd already been a psychologist for a long time, and I had a male trainee, and I think actually it happened slightly before that. Before this guy became my trainee, I did a lecture at University of East London on psychological therapies and what they have in common and what the differences are. And it was 30 women and one man. And he came up to me afterwards from this lecture and said, "Can you help me? I'm the only man on this course." And all of it's about male power, and all the lectures are about male dominance,
Wow.
and that's just getting to me. And I said, "Well, I'll try and help you." And it made me think, yeah, I'd been a psychologist for all these years, and I'd never thought of men as having issues. I
Mm.
just thought people got depressed, men and women, the same thing. There are women's issues because feminism, quite rightly, raised a lot of women's issues into the foreground, which needed to be. But
Mm.
then it suddenly hit me there are men's issues, and no one wants to talk about those ones. So that's an equal area. That's a completely blind area. I
Mm.
suddenly looked into it. This trainee, David Spector, his name, is a lovely guy. He's out in Australia now, but he'd done his dissertation on male postnatal depression. So to be fair to him, he opened my eyes, and he was a trainee. But I was in my 40s then, and I suddenly thought, wow. And to my credit, once I got that light bulb, I got straight into it, and I
Yeah.
started doing a lot on it. But he became my trainee, and we ran a men's group with a German psychotherapist. He was brilliant, and we started working with men in a different way. We created male spaces in the hospital, and all the hardest men that no one wanted to treat because they were all being referred around, we put them in a group.
Mm.
And we just started to run a men's group, and we realized a men's group, you have to go, it has to be very different than a standard therapy group. You can talk about something really banal, and then suddenly it becomes emotional for 2 seconds, then it goes back to being banal again. And that's exactly what you need to do with men's groups. You know, there are all sorts of elite models of psychotherapy which say you must keep people in this structure and talk about feelings, this, that, and the other. But no, if you want to get a man to talk about the feelings, we realized you have to be prepared not to talk about their feelings, and then the feelings come in at the right time. And we had to start developing a language of how to help men. I've been working with that issue ever since, but that's how it started. It was a male trainee, who was completely lost in the system. And even to this day now, in psychology and other therapy fields, male trainees are in a massive minority, and the training model is very feminized. In
Yeah.
other words, we're expected to treat people by talking to them like would be mostly comfortable for a woman to talk. Men talk differently, and instead of adapting our therapies to how men talk and how they behave, we're trying to force men into a mold of female-style conversations, which is very bad psychology
Mm.
and bad science, really.
Yeah, it's really interesting that it's that, like you say, there's that idea that getting people to talk about their feelings is the thing that we need to be doing. But actually, sometimes men will be speaking about something which seems maybe not as significant. And then suddenly the feelings just creep out. And it's like,
Mm.
okay, I get a gauge of that now. Um, but yeah, treating people individually and understanding the differences, I suppose, is key. So it's quite alarming to hear that the way it's being taught is almost sort of one-sided or not opening up the full experiences of both sides.
Yeah. I mean, you see programs on TV where people are tearing their hair out, men and women who have kids with issues, and they've got the house doesn't suit them, and they do the house up, and these people's mental health is completely transformed. Or you don't have to talk to them at all, other than you're doing something for someone changes their mental health.
Mm.
If you're a young man with no confidence and someone puts you in a football team, and you get given a hand around the shoulder and help to become a good footballer. If you go to a boxing club, you become confident. You don't have to sit down and talk how you're feeling. You show
Mm.
how you're feeling, and people do stuff. And with young men, the things that often help them are what people do. And the same with women too. It's not what we say, it's what we do. Words can be actions if they're truly sincere and in the right context. But this overemphasis on talking, I think, comes from a medical idea that in psychiatry you give a drug in psychotherapy, you give a word. The word is like a little drug. You give it and someone's going to be cured by your wonderful words. But it isn't like that. It's a relationship. Relationships are not about talking, they're about connecting. So if I want to connect with someone who's a man and he wants to talk about football, that's a connection. That's helpful. It's not avoiding feelings. In fact, if you support a football team, maybe a lot of your feelings are in that. That attachment is very important. So we've got to change the culture to be a bit more male-friendly, I think, in all of our ways of dealing with mental health. And also with women too. I mean, not all women love face-to-face talking is the best way of dealing with their problems.
Yeah.
So you've got to respect human need for connection. The human need for connection is the most important thing. And talking is one massive way of connecting, obviously, but it's not the only way.
Yeah, that's really important. And speaking to Dr. Susie Bennett on the podcast before, she was speaking about the male experience, obviously, but the recent, maybe going to recent years, so how the Me Too movement and stuff like that caused, like you said before, correctly so, certain issues for women to be brought up, but it created this idea that men are bad as a result of it. And obviously there's a lot of good men, and if you're being labeled that way, it can really have an impact on people. Around that as well, you've got the term toxic masculinity that gets thrown around all the time.
Yes, it does.
So how do you respond to that narrative of toxic masculinity?
Yeah, well, myself and my colleague John Barry, we've done a lot of work together since the last 15 years, really. We came up with a theory called gamma bias theory to try and explain this, because obviously we wanted not just to moan about it, but to kind of be scientific about it, because our instincts was this is prejudice against men. If you called anyone else toxic, if you called someone toxic because of their race, or toxic because of their religion, or toxic because of their height, you'd be absolutely called out rightly for prejudice. But toxic because of your male gender seems to be acceptable, which John and I realized is the prejudice. The prejudice against men is that we believe we can't be prejudiced against them. We sort of blind to anything we say about them is okay, because there's this assumption that somehow men's lives are impervious. So we came up with a gamma bias theory, which is really 4 aspects to gamma bias. One is that when men do good things, the gender narrative doesn't highlight that as a gender issue. So like men firefighters, most firefighters are men, well over 90% of firefighters are men, but we now call them firefighters. But a much greater percentage of people who commit sexual assaults are women than are male firefighters. So you've got a substantial minority of those who will say do sexual assaults or perpetrate sexual offences or domestic violence, those kind of things. Women are a substantial minority there, and yet we don't include them in the narrative on that at all. But when a woman is a firefighter, we include the women in the firefighting statistics. So what we're basically doing is, when men are heroic or do wonderful things, we don't make it a male gender issue anymore.
Right.
And when men do bad things, we don't include the women. So it makes it look like men are not doing great stuff, but they're only doing bad stuff. Same with privileges. When men get privileges, we highlight that. When men get disadvantages, we don't highlight that. So the gender narrative has become so corrupted now that toxic masculinity is acceptable. I mean, I've been on various media outlets to sort of talk about, if you had to generalize about men, you'd call them protective, because the vast majority of men will save your life, not take it. If you're a woman, men have evolved to protect women and children. That's their whole purpose. In fact, if you look even now on the Geneva Convention, policies, just the media reporting on wars and all kinds of dangerous situations, they say so many women and children were hurt. They never mention the men. So we've evolved to protect women and children. So what we've got now is a combination of an evolved instinct to protect women and children anyway, plus a kind of post-feminist thing that men are all bad. And so now we've just got this idea that where we're not thinking about men as having any problems or being victims of anything, and we're thinking only of them in terms of their worst characteristics of a minority, because rapists and murderers, thankfully, obviously there's far too many of them, but thankfully it's less than 0.5% of men. You know, and all of the men who are dangerous, you look into their histories, they've all been abused themselves. That's not justifying their crimes, but men don't go around abusing women or children because they're men. They do it because they've been abused. And a man who's been abused will behave in certain ways differently from a woman who's been abused. But women can also be violent or abusive in verbal ways or emotional ways. But the point is that even if men are the majority of certain categories of offence, there's still a substantial minority of women, and we don't talk about those. But when men are the massive majority of good things like firefighting, military, defence, all the dangerous jobs, 96% of people who die at work are men because they're doing all the dangerous stuff like building and mining and all the really dangerous stuff, up tall buildings or down big holes. Men are all there doing that, taking those risks for society. But no one says, oh, masculinity is lovely, isn't it wonderful? But when a man does a bad thing, which is a minority of men, suddenly it's all toxic. And we're going into schools now teaching toxic masculinity to kids, which is disastrous. You know, you're giving boys the image that there's something wrong with them just for being male. So we've got a real problem of the narrative that we've got for men now. And we need basically to go back to basic statistics.
Yeah.
You know, you shouldn't be generalizing about all men from a tiny minority. You should be, if you're going to generalize about men, let's say protective masculinity, because that's what it is. I know you work in the fire service. I mean, most firefighters are men, and they're protecting us every day.
Yeah, and I suppose like on that, so whilst over 90% are men, if you're going to rightly so make sure everyone's aware that there are women doing it as well, well, surely when bad things are happening, rather than just saying it's men doing it, you've got to make people aware that women are doing that as well.
Exactly.
So
you've got to be even-handed.
Yeah.
So if you're going to talk about everything or nothing, you know, if you're going to talk about all offending behaviour, talk about it all, both genders. If you're going to talk about all the good stuff, talk about, you know, and if you're interested in percentages, fine, because there are certain categories where women are more negative than men, like the murder of young children. And that's not abortion, that's children, you know, infanticide. There are certain areas where women, but it's still a tiny minority of women. The women that do that are damaged women. They're not doing it because they're women. Same with men. They're not rapists because they're men. They're rapists because they've been abused or treated very badly, or have no respect for women because of the way they've been taught to believe that women are, which there are cultural issues there. But on the whole, most men are protective of women and have been. I mean, when the Titanic sank, only one woman traveling first class died.
Wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah. 80% of the women survived the Titanic, of all classes, and 80% of the men died.
Yeah.
Because the men were trying to protect the women and put them in the boats. And we need to be, you know, I don't want people going around saying, you know, idealizing men, but if we're going to start slagging them off as toxic, we ought to get it right. We ought to be saying, no, actually, most men are protective, you know, families, communities, but it's always the bad guys that get the publicity.
It's a very broad generalization, like you say, of the minority that spreads a whole gender, 50% of the population, in this way. And again, the effects that will have on these people who aren't doing those bad things, getting told you're toxic. And again, you mentioned in there in school we're teaching this.
We are.
I mean, how damaging is that going to be going forward? That's got to be.
Yeah. I think there are various moves to change that now. I mean, the Family Education Trust did a good report. You know, people want to Google the Family Education Trust report on education in schools, on boys. People are starting to object to it now,
Mm.
but there's still a predominant sort of culture that boys are default. Unless you educate boys, they're going to be bad people. It's as if the default is somehow you need to educate boys out of being bad.
Yeah.
Whereas the default human being is a lovely, loving human being. Boys and girls are on average different, not totally different, and obviously there is a lot of overlap, but the idea that one gender is somehow needs educating to not become bad is itself a very awful idea that's damaging to our society, damaging to our young men and women, because women learn to fear,
Yeah.
unnecessarily be frightened of men, that men are somehow all potential uh, killers or rapists. And of course, one is one too many, but the statistics, if you presented those statistics to someone traveling by an airplane, you'd say, never get in an airplane. The important thing is to understand why men who are toxic are toxic. They've been abused.
Mm.
They have no respect for themselves and they hate other people. That can happen to women too, but they behave in different ways. So the key thing is to respect boys. So if you're going into schools disrespecting them, you're actually making the problem worse. If you're gonna, if you want to improve the problem, just respect all kids. And if they have problems, try to help them individually, but don't generalize about people. And that is one of my missions now, I guess, is to challenge this toxic masculinity narrative, because there's no other group of people you could put the word toxic with and get away with it, which itself proves the bias. No one else would accept being called toxic, but men are supposed to accept that label. And okay, some people say, well, it's only some men, but yeah, so don't call it toxic masculinity then.
Yeah.
Because anyone can be toxic. A woman can be toxic. Uh, anyone from any culture can be toxic. Any age group can be toxic. Human beings what makes a human being toxic is usually being treated very badly and then taking it out on someone else.
Yeah, I think it's really important. Points to make, and again, that last point about not labeling anyone else as toxic is something I've never thought about. But yeah, it's absolutely right. One of the things that you mentioned in there was the domestic abuse and some of the complexities that surround that. Men a lot of the time get overlooked as victims of domestic abuse, whereas when George was on here from the Tin Men, he was telling me that to a third, maybe more, of victims of domestic abuse are men. So
Yeah.
have we got to that point?
Well, I think the interesting question is whether that was always the case and we just never even bothered to even think about it, or whether men are more abused than they used to be. I don't know that, but all I know is that once the biggest light bulb for me on that was when I looked into the women's refuge movement, which was started by a lovely woman called Erin Pitsey. She created the first women's refuge in Chiswick in the early 1970s. And it was all going swimmingly. She got this safe house for women. They were all chilling out and swapping stories and supporting each other. And then Erin noticed that the women were also talking about their own violence, and there'd been reciprocal violence, or they had been they were talking about the men in their lives in a way which showed the men also were being victimized. And so Erin said, okay, I'm going to start doing something for men too. As soon as she did that, she got booted out of her own charity. She
Wow.
got death threats. Your listeners should look up the story of Erin Pitsey. It's Pizzey. Her story is illustrative of the fact that even if you're a woman and you're a feminist and you want to help women victims of domestic violence, as soon as you start trying to help men, then you get a lot of hostility. So people cannot treat it as an equal thing. It's got to stay a woman's issue. You still see that now in the culture of the women's charities, women policies on violence against women. It's all very, it's all written as if men aren't victims, when in fact that's absolutely, as George would have told you, at least a third of victims of domestic violence are men. And in fact, the figures are probably higher because A, men don't report it because they know they're not going to be believed. And also, when people have academically researched it, people like Liz Bates has done a lot of work on this area. She's found that, and other researchers have found that the rates of domestic violence can be quite reciprocal. Most domestic violence is reciprocal. And where it's non-reciprocal, i.e. that one party is injuring the other and the other isn't hitting back, there's more women initiating it. So, you can play games with this, and we don't want gender wars, but the important thing is to say that men are substantial numbers of victims and women are substantial numbers of perpetrators. But you wouldn't believe that from the way the money is funded into charities. You've got the Mankind Initiative now trying to help male victims. It's all a bit of a struggle to get the politicians to recognise it, because, the whole narrative is that men are dangerous and that women are victims. And of course that's true in some cases, but it's not the whole picture. So yes, and then we're trying to prevent male suicide, aren't we?
Yeah.
Everyone's saying, come on guys, open up. But supposing you're a victim of male suicide, you're a victim of domestic violence, and someone's saying, come on, open up. But no one wants to know you. If you're a male victim of domestic violence, there are now some services and charities, but really, generally speaking, if you're a male victim of domestic violence, you're unlikely to be believed, taken seriously. You might not get a refuge or anywhere to go.
Yeah.
So then you're more likely to take your own life. So if we want to prevent male suicide, we've got to change our whole attitudes to men. It's not men that have to change. It's our whole attitudes to men are wrong, because we see them as not victims. And in domestic violence, people think, oh, men are big and strong, they're just the bad guy. But I had a client who was a soldier. I won't go into too much detail, obviously, and he's given me permission to talk about it, but I won't go into too much detail. But it's just a soldier who was, his wife would chuck things at him and hit him with objects and make him bleed. And the neighbours would call the police and they'd take him off. They would never ask questions because they just assumed that he's the man, he's the bully. And there've been various programs on the media recently, I think a few documentaries showing male victims. But it's still very hard to challenge that narrative, because whenever you do anything on male issues on the telly, people do go, oh yes, that's not very nice, and 2 days later it's all gone back to the status quo. I did a documentary with Danny Dyer, I just appeared on one of his, he did a documentary on how to be a man, and he covered male victims of domestic violence. And he came to talk to me in Sunderland about it, because that's where there's only one male psychology module in the world which teaches about male psychology. So if we're living in a man's world, why is there only one university in the whole world that offers a course on male psychology? We just don't teach it because we don't even think about men.
Yeah.
So Danny Dyer spoke to me up there, and I appeared in his documentary for a few minutes. But that documentary had an impact. But I'm a realist. I realize that people aren't going to suddenly throw their hands up and say, oh, poor old men, they've got issues too. But you've got to chip away at it. So I'm grateful that people like yourself are doing these kind of podcasts, because by doing that, you're changing the world just a little bit, because it's all about truth, Because women too needed truth. When a young woman in the early 20th century wanted to be a doctor, the truth was she was having a battle to become a doctor. And the truth was needed to be challenged. That reality of prejudice against women being doctors needed to be challenged. And quite rightly, and now women are doctors. So all prejudices should be challenged.
Yeah.
The sad thing is that we have such a big prejudice about men that we think there aren't any men's issues. Yeah. We think men are just okay, or they're doing bad stuff, or they're just okay. And of course they're not.
Yeah. And even when presented with some of these stats and actual facts about how men might be suffering, it seems to be able to be shut down very quickly by just throwing a few, like the terms toxic masculinity, back the other way, and suddenly it's forgotten about. So yeah, like you say, chipping away is the perfect phrase, I think, and just
Yeah, and doing
constantly.
science. John Barry and myself, we've been doing research for the last few years. I'm more of a clinician than a researcher, but like all psychologists, you train in research methodology. But John and I work as a partnership, and we design research and do research, and you're creating a body of knowledge. Other people are doing stuff, and it's beginning to build up. We created the male psychology section of the British Psychological Society.
Yeah.
That was a battle.
Yeah, you fought for 10 years for that, right?
Yeah, fought about 10 years to get it, and then a third of psychologists voted against it. But we managed to get it. It just shows the level of prejudice against men's issues, because you're only saying, well, men should have we should have an equal interest in the lives of a male as a female of the species. And let's face it, they live together. So if we want to care for our children, we need to understand the male and the female experience. And of course, the reality is the best people who've written about that are not psychologists. They're novelists, people like that. There are great accounts of men's lives, but they're in great novels and great works of art, because novelists aren't prejudiced.
Yeah.
They're interested in people. I mean, one of my favourite authors is George Eliot, and her book Middlemarch gives you a fantastic insight into the psychological suffering of the male characters as well as the female characters, and their issues that made them suicidal or made them feel they'd lost the point of their life. You've only got to read a good book or think about these things for 10 minutes to realise how you would help male suicide.
Yeah.
But sadly, in our public policy, it's all sort of very unfriendly to the male gender, even our education policy. And when you get one maverick person like Andrew Tate, suddenly he becomes a story. I mean, the only reason Andrew Tate's even talked about is because he's a sort of toxic example or he becomes another example of toxic masculinity, rather than people realizing he's a reaction to this complete anti-male narrative. All boys are hearing is this negative stuff. So of course someone's going to come along and be a rebel. And Andrew Tate's not a great guy, but the reason he's popular to the extent that he is because at least he's being positive about masculinity. I mean, no one else is being.
And he brings up the problems that the men are facing. Again, like you say, I say the solutions that he suggests probably aren't the best, but he's acknowledging those problems, and it's for some of these people, some of these boys who look up to him, is the first time they feel heard or understood by someone. So naturally.
Exactly, and that's boys need role models, and I always say this about gangs. Why do boys join gangs? And of course girls join gangs as well. But why do boys join gangs? Because it gives them a feeling of worth, feeling of a purpose, belonging, and it creates a sort of sense of power when they feel worthless and powerless, and in the place of there hasn't been a positive male role model in their life. So instead of moaning about Andrew Tate, we should be seeing Andrew Tate as a symptom of the fact there aren't enough positive role models, or we're not pointing them out to boys. There are loads of great positive role models for boys.
Absolutely.
There's you, for example. You're doing this lovely podcast. There's
Thank you.
loads of guys out there doing great stuff. But how many schools are saying, listen to this guy? They're saying, oh, don't listen to Andrew Tate. You're all going to become like him if you're not careful. In fact, there's loads of fabulous guys out there doing wonderful stuff, but the schools aren't pointing boys towards that. Schools don't even have that many male teachers themselves.
Yeah.
Why aren't schools saying, let's stop being negative about boys. Let's have some more male teachers. Let's do some more male-friendly lessons, or, let's teach boys in a way that relates to their experience of life.
Yeah.
But we're not doing that.
And I suppose it's also important to point out that it gets split a lot. So we talk about men's problems and women's problems, but men's problems aren't only men's problems, and women's problems aren't only women's problems. They affect. Men will have daughters, wives, mothers, sisters. So men need to be able to understand what women may experience, stuff like menopause, how that can affect people.
Yeah.
and vice versa. So when we're talking about men's problems, we're not just, a lot of people just say, no, it's men moaning, men don't need to talk about whatever. But we also want to help educate the women in our lives and how they can support the men in their lives, the men that they love, who will be going through some of these experiences. So by helping them understand how the experiences do differ, it crosses gender, I think, in that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the whole point of gender is the difference that men and women come together, they create kids and create families, communities, and men and women are different for positive reasons, creativity. And, we exaggerate. Again, there's a kind of now a sort of gender war almost, that we are seeing versus women instead of
Mm.
seeing that the whole reason men and women evolved is to create kids and have lives together in families and communities. And men and women do talk to each other, and they do uh, mainly have positive relationships. We're always focusing on the negative. But yeah, and daughters, without all the evidence on mental health is that girls as well as boys suffer if there isn't a father in their lives.
Mm.
It's the same kids if they don't have male role models at school. So all the evidence on mental health and other outcomes points to the fact that where there are no father figures, you get more problems for girls and boys. So that isn't toxic masculinity. That's not enough masculinity. You see
Yeah.
what I mean? We need more father figures, and we're denigrating the masculine image so much that we're damaging. It's self-harm, because masculinity is just the converse of femininity. The two go together. And in fact, people have not everyone's in 100% masculine or 100% feminine. Anyway, we all have a bit of both. Uh, the Jungian idea of the male and female anima figure and animus figure. We basically psychologically are evolved to work together and I think we exaggerate the differences sometimes too much,
Mm.
instead of accentuating what is good about family life and good about men and women being together. And of course, some people are homosexual and they have feminine and masculine aspects because all relationships have a masculine and a feminine aspect.
Yeah.
Even if you're homosexual, there's a more masculine and a more feminine aspect. So the key thing is these are aspects of humanity. We shouldn't be saying any of it is toxic because we're creating an ideological stance which is anti-science, and it's actually undermining our own social cohesion.
Mm. And with, you mentioned in there about the role that a father figure plays, and before about the role models in like lives for younger boys. How does that father figure, what effect does that have on a boy during his childhood, and what does not having that figure around cause to happen potentially?
Well, I think for the boy, it's like it's an identification. There are certain males. I mean, male parenting does have a different quality on average to female parenting, a bit more rough and tumble, a bit more, you know. Again, people will say, "Oh, it's just stereotypes." It's not stereotypes. Obviously there are stereotypes. Generally, are just differences that are archetypes merely. But my position on it is that boys and girls are different, but on average, they are different. So there are, boys are more interested in certain things, even as babies, than girls. Girls are more drawn to social stimuli, boys more into action stimuli. And you see that even in films, don't you? There's action movies and there's more social movies. So
Yeah.
these differences are important. The key thing is not to feel anyone has to be that way. If you're a girl and you want to be an engineer, great, But equally, if on average more girls don't want to be engineers, so what? You don't force them. Like we're now trying to force boys to be more feminine in the way they talk. These are crazy things. But a boy without a dad hasn't got an identification
Mm.
and hasn't got that. Just as a girl without a mum, but equally, girls need dads to learn how to sort of bounce off a male figure in their lives,
Yeah.
to learn to become, to learn that they are loved as a daughter, and then they're not likely. In fact, there's evidence that shows that girls more go into earlier sexual relationships if they haven't had a dad, because it's like they're missing that masculine bit of their life, so
And
they're
fill
more
that gap.
promiscuous in
Right.
their search for a male object, love object, because they haven't had a kind of male fathering that gives them that sort of security, and they don't need to rush off and find a boyfriend so fast. All of this stuff,
Yeah.
and with boys, obviously, and we say this to any minority, don't we? Oh, you need representation. Anyone from a minority, quite rightly, wants to think, I want to see someone who looks like me. Well, if you're a boy and you don't see someone that looks like me, you, a man, of course that's going to change your sense of yourself. It's going to suppress certain potentialities. It's going to accentuate certain things, and you will, and that's not to say like a single parent doesn't do a great job, because that's another thing I don't want to do is slag off single parents who do a great job. But, you just need men and women are human beings come in two basic genders, don't they? Okay, there's arguments about that, but on the whole, 99.5% of people you would say are male or female on the whole. So that's a pattern, and therefore we need to identify. And if you don't have men in your life, at school or at home, for a boy that becomes difficult. You can't internalize a sort of positive sense of who you are in such an easy way. You might therefore get more drawn into, I don't know, a rap artist or something, or a gang, or anything that
Yeah.
is more masculine or whatever. So these things are only attempts to correct problems which we need to see what the problem is. Not, it's like Tate is just a false solution to what the problem is.
Yeah.
We need more male role models who are good male role models, and you wouldn't get Andrew Tate. Uh, but there are loads of good male role models. But we never celebrate them.
Mm.
We never say these boxing coaches that are out there, aren't they great for boys? We never say that. We never make it about gender when it's positive stuff.
Yeah.
So we need to do more of that, I think.
Yeah. And I've mentioned already George on this, but during his episode with me, he told me about some work you did with the Samaritans,
Yeah.
where over the course of a year, you managed to sort of double the time men were spending on the phones
Yeah.
with the Samaritans. Can you talk us through a bit what you did there and how that worked?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a project called Man Talk, 2014. That's more than 10 years ago now, which is frightening. But I did that with someone called Michael Walton. The two of us set up this project, which was basically a year-long intervention, trying to, and because 80% of Samaritans volunteers are women.
Yep.
Just as 80% of counsellors are women, 80% of psychologists, there seems to be an 80% rule when it comes to talking or listening, kind of helping approaches. So we thought we would do an exposure of all the volunteers, including the men as well, of course, to what men's lives were like. And at the beginning of the project, we measured how long the phone calls lasted. So we had a sample of about 1,000 phone calls, and we found a certain percentage were under 5 minutes. Many more phone calls with men were under 5 minutes than with women. So
Right.
men were more likely to have a short phone call and just hang up, sort of thing. So then we spent a year just exposing all the volunteers to men's lives, not directly by lecturing, but we got in a blues guitarist.
Mm.
And he came and played some blues music for all the volunteers. And we said, what are those lyrics about? What are men doing there? Most blues music, if you listen to it, is about men suffering. My woman left me and all this misery.
Yeah.
We think men don't express their feelings. It's there every day in our art. So we did that. We played blues music. We got the Royal Shakespeare Company came in, and all the women agreed to play the men's parts and tell us what that felt like. And they said, gosh, they were doing Julius Caesar. Of course, being the London Samaritans, we had some really nice people who were like the Royal Shakespeare Company were prepared to help. So that was a lovely thing. But they came in and said, yeah, these Roman politicians, the pressure on them, they felt they had people's lives. They were responsible for all these lives, and they felt suicidal about getting it wrong. They suddenly realized that even these powerful men, they wouldn't have an easy life. They really had a massive struggle with who's going to kill them. They didn't feel safe. They were under threat. They were trying to protect their people. So we all had a kind of debate about what the gender meant in Roman times. And we did various other things. A cellist came along and played some music and then said, what did that feel like as a male cellist playing that? So we tried to just open up the minds of the female, mainly volunteers, and the men as well, to what it was like to be a man.
Yeah.
And then after a year of doing that, we measured the phone calls again. And suddenly all these calls that were less than 5 minutes, there were very much less calls that were, the men were speaking for longer, and there were much fewer. We halved the number of calls that were less than 5 minutes for men.
Yeah.
So even without telling the women or the men volunteers how to listen, by just changing their minds, exposing them, what had changed? We hadn't changed the callers because they didn't know we'd been doing this. What we'd changed is the way we were listening. So what that proves is if you change the way you listen to men, they will talk better. It's nothing to do with the men. You listen better to men and they will talk. So it's not about, come on, guys, open up. The message should be, come on, society, let's listen to men better.
Yeah. And that's the thing at the minute is men need to talk more. Men should be talking. Let's help men talk. But we're not actually giving them the space or opening our minds to, as a society potentially, to how we make that happen and how we start to listen to men better. So by just like you did there, getting people to understand the experience more, not lecturing about, okay, when they say this, you might say this in return. That's not gonna change it. But just a deeper understanding and the effect that had. That's really, really interesting.
Yeah. So, I did in 2007, I did a national advisory group for the health secretary at the time. It was Patricia Hewitt in the Labour government, but I managed to get the role of a sort of temporary advisor to her on mental health. And we came up with 5 great needs for mental health, which is the other big message I would have today, is that mental health isn't a series of mental conditions. Mental health is the human condition, which has 5 really big psychological needs. So it's to be loved, to be heard, to belong, to make a difference, and to have some meaning or purpose in your life. Now, if you treat everyone in terms of how can I meet that person's needs in those respects, rather than what condition have they got, how can I treat it, mental health services would be a whole load better. So when it comes to men, if you think about how can I help this guy feel cared about, how can I help him feel heard, how can I help him feel he belongs, how can I help him make a difference, how can I help him have a purpose? If you meet any of those needs, his mental health will improve. Now, talking is only one way of meeting those needs.
Yeah.
You might help him feel you belong by putting him in a football team. You might help him feel heard by not talking to him because he doesn't like talking. Do you see what I mean? You might help him feel cared about by, I don't know, lending him 10 quid if he's hungry. Do you know what I mean? It's not about treating mental conditions. It's about meeting the needs of the human condition. And once I got that idea in mental health, and it went down well with the health secretary, that idea, but sadly, like all health secretaries, they don't last very long, and those kind of ideas didn't go into the policy department. But I still use those a lot in my work, and it applies to men and women. So if you want to make a man or a woman feel heard, you don't have to do the same things on average. So the key thing about men is it's not about them talking more, because if they talking only helps depending on who's listening, what attitude they're listening with, what are the consequences of them listening. So if you're a male victim of domestic violence and you ring up a standard kind of female-oriented domestic violence charity, the way you will be listened to will not help you. It might harm you. The point is that listening can be unhelpful. If you go to a doctor and with mental health problems and they're not very good at mental health, that might make you feel worse. If you go to a mental health hospital and no one's got any time for you because the staff are all burned out and you were a rejected kid, You've got mental health problems. You go into a hospital, and the staff haven't got time for you either, and you were rejected in your family. It reinforces the sense of rejection. So, and even if someone is listening to you, they might listen to you and then tell you what to do, just give you some really bad advice. So, listening isn't talking and listening aren't the panacea. It's really connecting with people that matters. The only thing that really makes a difference, and this is true with teachers as well. We go into school. Well, who are the teachers we all remember who changed our lives?
Yeah.
The ones that connected with us,
Yeah.
not the ones that just lectured us.
Yeah. I really like that idea of the five ways to sort of connect with someone to make them
Yeah.
heard and all of that. That's really interesting to see what other things people need,
Yeah.
spanning genders.
Absolutely.
In terms of your from your experience, what are some strategies that have been effective in order to get men talking a bit more about these feelings when they are going through that stage?
Well, I think the best way to help men talk when talking is useful is to create an environment that is male friendly. That means for some a male space where other men are kind of there, which means we're all guys together. It's okay to talk because we're all doing it. That helps. The fact that that's why I discovered early on really that men's groups are better than mixed groups for that. Because if you have a mixed group of men and women, the men tend to clam up and they tend to protect the women a bit. And the women feel a bit anxious, but also they just talk to each other, But if you create, and of course some issues, you need women's groups because they may have had men in their lives that weren't safe, so they need a space that's safe. So for men too, they need a space where they can be a bit more less inhibited. So one strategy to get men talking, where talking, as I say, talking isn't the only answer, but where it is, a men's space. And there are lots of charities now that create really good group, men's spaces. Even like things like men's sheds. The good thing about men talking is the best spaces for men is where they don't have to sit there and talk the whole time.
Yeah.
The worst thing is if you're in a room and you're expected to talk the whole time. So therapy sessions are quite off-putting for men in some ways because it's just like, you're going to sit here and talk now for an hour and there's nothing else to do but talk. Whereas if it's a men's shed, you can be banging a nail into something and talking while you're doing
an
it.
activity.
Men often talk better when they're doing something, like if you're driving.
Yeah.
If you notice, men will have a great conversation, not looking at the other guy, but while they're driving somewhere or while they're doing something, running, playing golf is a great one for men.
Yeah.
Men, I'm sure men do most of their talking on a golf course, down a pub, because you can do, not so much pub, but I suppose pub because you are, you're doing stuff as well. You're playing darts or you're this. The key thing for guys is a male-friendly environment isn't just a one-to-one space. Women love, not some women hate it, but a lot women quite love that intense one-to-one stuff. Really, for men that can be not rewarding. But they do want to talk, but they'll do it as they talk about. So we've got to create male spaces that are more male-friendly. That's the first thing. When men are victims, you've got to acknowledge that and respect the fact that there are male victims. That's not to put down the women victims because they're both. It's not men versus women, it's both.
Absolutely.
And if there are children involved, if you don't help the men, then you're harming the children in the lives of those men. So we've got to create spaces where there are helplines for men that actually respect them, that include men. We've got to do, the family courts need to improve to be more male friendly. Then men will talk more, they'll feel more trusting. If you want men to talk, they've got to have more trust. To develop trust in men, you've got to treat them with equal respect. We know the fact that even in the court system, men get longer sentences for the same crimes. They're more likely to go to prison for the same crime. So these are big gender biases in the way we treat men and women. So you can't just expect men to talk unless we change our way of listening. That was what came out of that Samaritans thing. We didn't change the men. We just changed the volunteers, and they were just listening in a slightly more open way. And if a man wanted to talk about Arsenal Football Club, you know, the Samaritans will often be trained to get them off that subject because he's avoiding his feelings. No, a man might talk to you about Arsenal Football Club to try and connect with you about something, to form a trusting relationship, and therefore that's a way into connecting with that man.
Yeah.
So we've got to retrain our counsellors, our volunteers, our therapists to be more male friendly, so that when men aren't talking about feelings, that they don't patronise them and say, "Oh, come on, tell me what's really bothering you," because actually that puts a man off. If you just say to a guy, "Okay, you're interested in Arsenal, fair enough, let's talk about that," then by talking about that, they're trusting you. And then you suddenly realise Arsenal matters to them anyway, because it is like the thing that gives their life a purpose. Because they go there every Saturday. It's their, when Arsenal lose, they're really upset. So it's not a trivial thing. And it's actually our attitude to men's feelings that is the problem, not men's feelings. So to get guys talking more, I just say, well, A, they wouldn't necessarily need to get them talking more, but need to get schools and communities and society as a whole listening better to men. And that means politicians as well. All these policies they've got don't include men. Things like violence policies, they're not even including men in the name of the policy. So we've got an equalities committee that's called the Women Inequalities Committee.
Really?
Yeah. So our political system assumes that women have equality issues and men don't.
Yeah.
So that is in itself a bias, isn't it? The whole political system is saying, if you're a man, you don't need equality. You've got it.
Yeah.
Which in terms of fatherhood, domestic violence,
Yeah. If you're a victim of any of those things,
homelessness, I mean, most rough sleepers are men. We're much more tolerant of someone being on the streets if they're male than if they're female. If they're female, we're more likely to try and shelter them. We're more caring towards women, and maybe that's even correct. But if we are going to be more protective of women, then we at least need to be honest about that and not pretend there's equality, because, we come back to the point about the Geneva Convention is there to protect women and children. It doesn't mention protecting men. So we don't believe in equality. We believe that men should protect women and children. That isn't equality. That is a privilege for women. And that might be correct, because if we want to protect our species and our societies, women give birth to kids, and we need to keep our women healthy. That's an evolutionary pressure to protect women and children, isn't it? And men have always done most of the protection. They've all often given their lives for that. So I think there are differences. So we shouldn't call everything 50-50, but we should respect men again. What we're failing to do now is respect men. We've got a narrative of toxic masculinity, but actually men are still expected to do all this protection.
Yeah.
So we've got a sort of perfect storm, which is harming, a narrative which harms the development of our young men.
Well, you only have to look at the statistics of male suicide, in that three quarters of suicides are by men.
Yeah.
And as Susie Bennett pointed out, when she first got into the field, she realised that in this world where we say men have it all and we're bringing up everyone else to the level of men, why are the men taking their own lives in such a high number in these deaths of despair if they've got all these privileges and all these, what's causing that? So it's just hearing all of the issues that everyone's experiencing and being open to every experience, I think, is the sort of key to it, I suppose, isn't it?
Absolutely. And there's a lot of research out there that shows that we attribute blame more to men for the same actions. So even when it's suicide, our natural tendency is to think, well, what's wrong with the guy that is taking his own life? We don't think, oh, poor man, what can we do to change life so he's less likely to be suicidal? We think, what's it about men that makes them kill themselves? Oh, they don't talk enough. So even when it comes to suicide, we're not empathic. And that was what William Collins called the empathy gap, which is part of our gamma bias theory, that, part of gamma bias is that when men suffer, we play that down. So, we don't think of even suicide. We don't think poor old men, we think, oh, come on, guys, open up and then you won't have to take your own lives. But as we've already seen, if a man is a victim of domestic violence, there's no, he can't open up because he won't be believed. There aren't very many services. And there's a prejudice, the very prejudice that makes people blame men even for their suicide is going to create suicide, not solve it. So we've got to, if we're not, we're not so empathic towards men, and there are certain evolutionary reasons for that. We're never going to get to a point, I think, where we expect society to be protected 50% by women. So let's just acknowledge the value of men, that they do protection. Yes, a few of them are toxic, but they're not toxic because they're men. They're toxic because they're damaged men. And damaged women are toxic in different ways, but they're still toxic. So toxicity isn't a gender issue.
No,
it's just except in how it's expressed.
It's an outcome of damage.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to a young man, boy, growing up in today's society, sort of going through this, and sort of how they can sort of find their place in the world, I suppose, in terms of hearing all this negativity around them? What advice would you give them?
Just find good, if you can, find good male role models, good teachers, community figures online, good, not Andrew Tate, because, I have no great, I don't respect what he's doing at all, but I know why he's there, because he's one of the only voices that's actually positive about masculinity, but not in a good way, sadly. But, I would say to young guys, it's very hard, because if you're a young person, you're getting this message, it's more about us needing to change, because the young guys are going to benefit from more podcasts like yours, or people like you maybe going to school talking about your career as a firefighter, or whatever. But what I would say is that for young boys who are online these days, seek out all the good stuff and think about, don't be fooled by this toxic masculinity narrative, because boys are human beings are great. Most human beings are wonderful. The toxic people are just damaged. But people come in male and female varieties, and we wouldn't exist without both. The idea that one is bad and toxic and the other isn't, it's just crazy. I mean, that is a pathology in us. But the young guys, I would say to them, hold on, there are some adults in your life trying to change things for you. We're trying to influence your parents and your teachers and the community around you and the politicians, all the people that create this sort of complex narrative you live in. We're trying to make that more male friendly for you. And we believe in you. And we know that most boys turn into wonderful adults. But we're actually, as a society, making that harder for boys by teaching them bad things about the male gender, based on a tiny proportion of bad guys rather than the vast majority of good ones. The narrative. So I'd be saying to them, we're on your side, and it's up to us adults to change this, make it better for you. And we hope that when you grow up, some of that would have got through to you, and you can in turn help other guys. But equally, as you said, I've been in the NHS 30 years, the charity sector 10 years, and worked independently, done all kinds of things. I'm more of a specialist in women's psychology than men's, because I've had probably 60 to 70% my clients are women. So again, I don't want to be labeled or think of myself as a men's issues psychologist. I'm a human, I'm interested in humanity. But I would like to think I've helped a lot of women, and I have over the years. And I didn't do that by seeing them as just in terms of their gender. I see people, human beings aren't defined just by their gender anyway.
Everyone's individual.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think it's a really important message for people to hear, especially if they are in that young phase of their life. In terms of society as a whole, then going forward, what changes can we make, or what changes would you like to see in how we sort of look at these issues facing men and boys?
Yeah, I think it's both ends up really. Schools are vital. We've got to see the needs of boys rather than uh, we've got to try and get more male-friendly influences in schools. We've got to try and get more male-friendly policies in government. We've got to try and change the language and the narrative. So we live in an age of social media. So I think people like yourself, this is why I agreed to do this, because I think you're doing great work in even, taking the initiative to do a podcast and try and make a difference, which is great. We need more people like you. And I will, I'm grateful to have the opportunity through you to say this. But it's it's the narrative. It's we talk about influencers now. So the influencers have got to become more male friendly.
Mm.
There's got to be less anti-male narrative, just as you're seeing, various narratives in the United States are now being challenged by a new government, rightly or wrongly to some people. But on the whole, that will do is change the culture of the way schools are run. We've got to do that with men's issues. We've got to change the way schools talk about gender. We've got to change the way that politicians get to discuss it. There's not enough balance on men's issues. Not enough. As I said, there's only one male psychology module in the world, and that's Sunderland University.
Enough, is it?
So we've got to have more of those. Universities, why aren't they teaching male psychology? Why aren't more men in psychology? Why aren't men interested in it? Well, if you look at the way it's taught, it would put most men off. So that's psychologists are to blame. We're not, because people like myself have tried to change it, but the whole culture is very, and they're still talking about, there's still a language as if somehow men are dominant, even in psychology, where the whole profession is now female dominated. And it's not matter if it's 60-40 or something, but it's about 80-20, which is a bit of a problem. I don't expect 50-50. I think psychology used to be like a laboratory science profession where you had animal behavior studies and all kinds of stuff. And then it's become more of a therapy profession. As it's become more therapy and counseling based, more women are interested, and that's just a gender difference. But nonetheless, we could do with more men in it, and they would be in it more if psychology was itself more male friendly.
Changes, yeah.
And that's why we set up the male psychology section. Well, that's a battle.
Yeah.
So that you have to start at the bottom and the top. The people in your own life, try to influence them. But try and influence the influences. That's why I'm talking to you, because your podcast must influence quite a few people. And therefore, if I'm talking to you, I might have a chance to get through to a few of your listeners. They might go off and influence someone else. So it's ripples. But in social media age, the good thing is we can influence people more quickly now. I suppose the flip side of that is that there's a lot of social media out there now. So there's people saying different things, competing things,
And you can
doing
influence
podcasts as
people
well.
badly as quickly as you
Yeah,
can.
and there's a lot. You've got to decide what's the good and the bad stuff.
Yeah. Martin, it's been absolute honour to have you on, and I've really enjoyed the conversation. Something I like to do at the end of an episode is ask the guests to leave a question for the listeners. So, like I said to you before we started, I enjoyed listening to podcasts. I enjoyed going away and having conversations about what I'd listened to. So if you could give the listener a question to go and start that conversation with someone in their life, a family member, a friend, what question would you give to the listener?
Yeah, I suppose the question would be, who would you most want to go to on the basis of having heard this podcast, who comes into your mind as the most significant person you would want to go and talk to about it?
Mm.
And what would be your main question for them, or the main thing you would want to tell them
Yeah.
about this so that you might influence them?
Mm.
So who's the person you'd most want to influence, and what would you want to say to them? I suppose that would be the question.
Awesome.
Everyone has in their life someone that they might want to go to and influence on this. It might be a teacher, it might be a parent, it might be a friend, so I just say, think about that. Who would you most, having heard our conversation today, who would you most want to report, go to about that? And what would you want to say to them, either to ask them or to tell them something?
Yeah.
But obviously that's going to be very different in different people's lives. But
Absolutely. Yeah.
that would be my point, I think.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for coming on today.
Cheers, Sam.
If people want to find you online or keep up to date with what you're publishing, where can they do that?
Well, I'm not sort of highly visible on. I'm on X or Twitter, so
Yeah.
Martin J. Seager on Twitter or X. I'm on LinkedIn, so you can find me on LinkedIn. But I haven't got my own website or anything like that. I'm not running any kind of company. I'm more freelance, just flitting about doing bits and pieces. But yeah, I am sort of not invisible, so you can get me on those things, and I'm always happy to respond to people. But yeah, and if you get feedback from this after today, then obviously I'm happy to come back in some point in the future, if that would help.
Yeah.
Do a follow-up, or I don't know how it works, but
Absolutely. There's
Yeah.
loads more questions and loads more topics that
Yeah.
we could go through. So yeah. I'll link it all below for anyone listening so they can go and have a look. And if they are interested in reading some more of your studies, they can do that there. If you have enjoyed this episode and you know someone who might enjoy it as well, please do share it with them, as it helps spread the word. And if you haven't already, if you follow and rate the show, that helps us get more visibility, reach new people, and again, influence more people in this way. And lastly, you can follow on Instagram at Lonely Chapter Podcast. And lastly, from me, thank you for listening.